So my aim for today is to give you all enough practical introductory methodological knowledge that you can start designing your own ESM studies. So that's the kind of takeaway I'm hoping to get you to. And I do know that some of you in this room have already run an ESM study. So some of this might not be new to you. And if you do actually have an idea or a suggestion that I haven't covered in the slides, do feel free to pop it in the chat and we can all help each other. Anything that you can suggest, we'd love to hear. So let's kick it off with an introduction. And the first thing that we need to start with, what are experience sampling methods, or ESM? So the idea of these methods is that we want to capture life as it is lived. So in psychology, we often get people into the lab or we have them answer questionnaires. And both of those methods are great at doing certain things, but they're not so great at actually looking into participants' lives. And in the end, that's what we're kind of interested in when we're doing psychology. So there's three kind of aspects of an ESM study. One is that we're following people into natural settings. So we're not having them in the lab, but instead we're following them into their normal lives, following them across weeks. The second is that we're getting real-time measurement or close to real-time measurement. So we might be asking people a few hours after something has happened. So instead of relying on participants' memories, we're instead actually sampling something as it occurs. We're going onto the ground of the measurement. And the final thing is that we get multiple measurement occasions. So we're not just asking people once, but we're following them across time. And using that data, we can see how someone changes and watch the paths, the dynamic paths that these variables follow. But there is a note I want to give about terminology. So you'll notice I use the term experience sampling, or ESM. And I think that is because it's the best kind of way of describing what it is we're doing. But there's a bunch of different terms that you probably come across, and different fields tend to prefer different terms. So this is one organization of terminology that I hope will help you contextualize this a little bit if you've come across these terms in your field before. So the top level kind of umbrella term is ambulatory assessment, which is not assessing ambulances, sadly. It's assessing movement. That's what the word ambulatory is for. And that encompasses two kind of broad groups of methods. Active methods, and that is a method where participants actually have to do something to respond. And passive methods, which are methods where participants just live their normal lives, but we're sampling them. So passive methods can be things like etigraphy. So if you have a Fitbit, you might be looking at your step count. They're things like mobile sensing, so GPS, or looking at words written or apps opened. There's a lot of apps for this. For example, Simon Dennis's group at UniMelb runs Unforgettable Me, which is a passive method. And psychophysiology, so things like heart rate, skin conductance, can also be measured outside the lab. And then there's the active methods. And today I'm going to focus on active methods, and I'm going to focus specifically on self-report active methods, which are experience sampling methods. Now, these are also sometimes called ecological momentary assessment, or EMA. That tends to kind of be a more common terminology, I think, in the clinical field. I prefer ESM because I think it's a little easier to understand, but EMA and ESM are the same thing. There are also diary studies. And so some people use the term diary studies to interchangeably with ESM or EMA. But for us, I generally would say a diary study is a type of ESM that tends to focus more on sort of retrospective measurement that's closer to the event, and is usually conducted one per day rather than multiple per day. But a lot of what I'll talk about today will apply also to diary methods. And you can also use another type of active method, which is biological samples. And this is an active method because you can't right now collect things like cortisol without participants actively giving you a sample. But that is something that's more and more common in this kind of research now. So that's the kind of tree of the different methods. And we're going to stick on this side. We're going to stick on self-report experience sampling methods. But if you're interested in all these other things, they're happening more and more. The only thing I'd caution you is that it's really hard to link all this stuff up. So if you want to go down a path of running a study that has self-report and etigraphy and GPS sensing, just have a think about what you're actually going to do to link all that data later on. Sorry, is there any questions so far that I need to pop in and answer?
Nothing at the moment, so seems to be good.
Okay, great. So I'm going to dive into now talking about why you actually might want to do one of these studies. And I'm going to talk about 4 big groups of advantages that I see as someone who does experience sampling mostly in my own work. And just, I think Narissa already gave you this context, but I focus mostly on emotions, which are things that do tend to fluctuate and change across time in really meaningful ways that we can't get out in the lab very easily. So these are kind of the different things that I see as advantages coming from my background, but you may also see other advantages, or you may not think this is an advantage for what you're doing. So just a little bit of a disclaimer about these. The first, and I think probably the most obvious of these advantages, is that ESM reduces recall bias. So when you sample someone's experiences in the moment or close to the moment by sending them, say, a smartphone survey, which is how this is usually done, you reduce the time lag between something happening and people responding to it. So you're asking them, you know, I had a stressful event. You asked me straight afterwards how stressed I feel, and I can tell you, instead of asking me a week afterwards, and I may sort of have had some changes that have changed how I thought about that event. This is evidenced in the fact that when we study it, we do see pretty good differences between momentary and retrospective ratings. So for example, in my field of study in immersion, when you ask people to rate their emotion intensity in the moment, and then at the end of the day and at the end of the week, what you find is that people overestimate their positive and negative emotional intensity at the end of the week or at the end of the day. When you ask them in the moment, they report feeling less intense positive and negative emotions than if you ask them retrospectively. And so that suggests that it's really important for us to grab emotion in the moment to get at what sort of really is happening there. Another thing that happens is you see a peak-end rule. So this particular study is in pain recall, and Stone and his colleagues asked rheumatoid arthritis patients to do an ESM on their pain levels and then to recall their pain levels at the end of the ESM period. And he found that those pain recall levels were most influenced by the peak of the pain across the week and then the most recent reports of pain. And so that's a pretty common thing you'll see across a lot of self-report, that people's reports are very influenced by the peak of an event and then the most recent event. And it's probably this peak that influences people to overestimate intensity and emotions. So there's a lot of different research on this recall bias, but it is something that we need to contend with, particularly in certain research areas. And this ties into this idea of this accessibility model of self-report. And Robertson and Claw suggest that there's 2 types of knowledge that we have about ourselves. The first is semantic knowledge, and that's kind of knowledge about the different sort of things that are tied to how we see ourselves. So they're sort of influenced by social norms, they're influenced by our culture, but they're not tied to a specific time or context or place. They're kind of a broad idea of what we have, a broad idea we have about ourselves. Experiential knowledge is more directly linked with our experiences. So it's asked in the time, in the context, and it's asked about our behavior in the context. So as psychologists, I think we're interested in both types of knowledge. A lot of us study things like norms and culture, and of course, then we're interested in semantic knowledge. And some things can be influenced more by semantic knowledge. So some of our decisions are guided by our memories about ourselves. But experiential knowledge is also really important, and it's a lot harder to study, as you can imagine, because you're asking people to recall their experiences, then their experiential knowledge starts being changed by their semantic knowledge, and it's sort of the things shift across time. So if you're interested in experiential knowledge, then you need to get something like ESM. The second important aspect of ESM is that it can increase our ecological validity. So those of us who do experiments, and I also do experiments, we know that the internal validity of our methods is quite high. We're careful, we're cautious, we don't let things confound our experiments. But the ecological validity can sometimes be quite low. So let me give you an example of this from emotion research. Often we would use the International Effective Pictures System, which is a group of pictures that have been validated to evoke certain emotions. And so I could look, one of the popular IAPS pictures is of a puppy. It's not this particular picture, but I just thought this puppy was cute. So that picture has been shown to evoke positive emotion. But you can imagine that it's going to be really different to look at that picture of a puppy and respond with how I feel than to actually hug a puppy like the woman in the photo. It's a qualitatively different experience, hugging and interacting with that puppy, than it is looking at a picture of the puppy. And so for things like emotion processes, we're interested in those qualitatively strong experiences that can have sort of influences over our lives. The kind of tie into this is that sometimes our lab effects, because maybe they're qualitatively different, don't replicate in the field. And this is particularly a problem in social psychology, and I am a social psychologist, so I'm allowed to dunk on my own field. In social psychology, this meta-analysis showed that our lab results were only kind of, I think it was about 0.5 correlated with field replications of the same results. And sometimes the results actually even changed directions when you took them into the field. So it's really important to get outside of the lab and understand those experiences. And I think a really nice example of this comes from this paper by Wilhelm and Grossman. They had participants in the lab and they had them do a TRIA social stress test. So those of us who study stress are probably pretty familiar with this, but it's a quite stressful public speaking task. Participants have to do this public speech with little preparation, and then they sit across from a panel of people in white coats who look at them angrily as they talk. And you can see there's a spike in this person's heart rate while they do that task in the lab. And then they have her wear a heart rate monitor out into her real life. And you can see that during the movie, she's getting relevant heart rate responses. But the most interesting one is the participant obviously was a soccer fan, and you can see her watching her favorite team play soccer on TV. And there's a huge spike here. But if we hadn't followed her into daily life, we'd be looking at this as a stress response instead of this as a stress response. So we can get at these kind of meaningful moments that matter outside of the lab. And these meaningful moments are important because how this participant's team performs on the soccer game is probably going to influence her life, or at least she will think so. Moving on, Marissa's laughing.
Is this example just entirely targeted at me? How dare you?
I want to get you to wear a heart rate monitor in future.
Can I just interrupt for one moment? A couple of people are having unstable connection issues, and I think it's just to do with all the videos that are switched on. And so if I can just ask a couple people to switch off, a couple people can of course stay on to keep Elise with nodding, but in an attempt to try and improve the quality a bit. Thank you so much, everyone. All right, sorry Elise that you're now talking to blank screens. How much we all hate that, but yet that's the thing that ruins the internet connection so much.
That's all right. I'll just pretend that you're all really enjoying this, and then I have no evidence to the contrary.
I will stay here and nod away, and yes, you can all use your reactions to clap and wave.
Yeah, you can just go find your favorite memes on the internet for me and post them in the chat. That's how you can
and I'll save the chat for that. And yes, this example is entirely targeted at me, so
yeah, so I was just going to say about this, this actually has personal relevance for this participant's life. Or if you take an example from your own life, like you go through a really stressful job interview, how you do in that job interview has personal implications, but how you do in a lab task does not. And so ESM is really nice because we can get into those moments that matter. The third group of advantages I want to talk about is the measurement of dynamic and within-person processes. And I think these are a really important part of ESM, and one that maybe people don't think about as much when they're new to the method. So the first thing is that when we have multiple assessment points, we can look at change across time. So this is a graph from a study that I did. And what we did was we had first-year participants who were doing their first semester exams take a smartphone with them in the days before and after receiving those exam results. And the study was conducted when I was doing my postdoc in Belgium, where a lot of students failed their first semester exams. And so we had, I think, about 80% of them failed statistics. So those of you who are educated in Australia should be very pleased that you did not have to take Belgian statistics. So what this shows is this sort of black bar is when the students got their results. And this is sorted by a pass percentage. So these people failed 100% of their exams, and these people in the white passed 100% of their exams. But I wanted to show you this graph because you can see the richness in these trajectories. People are all responding in really different ways, and you can see that there's change across time. There's spikes and there's falls, and not one participant really has the same trajectory. And so when you use ESM and you follow these kind of events, or you follow people, you can see these changes across time. in a way that you can't when you can't follow them for this long. And you can see them with the granularity that you couldn't get from doing a longitudinal study. This is, of course, like a very messy big picture version of this. In ESM, we can do it by just very simply looking at how things at the previous time point predict things at the next time point. And so we can start getting at the directionality of our effects. The second part of this one is that we can separate between and within person effects. So let me explain what I mean here. So when I say a between person effect, what I'm looking at is how one person is different from another person. And in psychology, this is often what we're studying. So for example, I might be looking at rumination and negative affect, and I might be able to conclude that someone who has higher levels of negative affect is also going to be more likely to ruminate. So I can make this sort of trait-trait association. But there's also within person effects. And when I look at within person effects, I'm looking at the same person across time and context. So if you look at me as a person, how do I change across the time points I'm sampled? And how do I move above and below my mean levels of the construct? And here I can make an inference like, in a situation where I experienced more negative emotion than usual, I'm also more likely to ruminate. So I'm able to make these more situational conclusions from my data. There's a bunch of examples on how separating these two things can reveal different effects. So one big example that's often used is stress and coping. Many coping strategies might be associated with stress on a between person level, because if I'm the kind of person who experiences a lot of stress, I'm also probably the kind of person who needs to use every coping strategy more. But when I look at the within person level and I find times at which people feel stressed, and then I can look at which coping strategies they seem to use in those times and whether those coping strategies predict a reduction in stress at the next time point. So there you're able to see how in situations where situations where you experience stress, which coping strategy helps your trajectory, rather than looking at that, well, I'm the kind of person who experiences stress, so I'm the kind of person who has to do coping more. So linked to this is this idea of taking an ideographic perspective. And I'm sorry, ESM researchers love a bit of jargon, so I'm going to introduce a bit more jargon. And what I mean when I say an ideographic method is a method that focuses on within person processes, so the processes I just told you about. An ideographic method aims to identify a pattern of behavior within a person rather than across people. So when I take an ideographic perspective, what I'm going to do is look at variation in individuals around their own, for example, mean levels. So for example, if I act in a more extroverted way than usual, is that associated with increased positive emotion? But if I was to take a nomothetic perspective, a between person perspective on that same question, I might ask, are extroverted people also more likely to experience positive emotion? So nomothetic methods are what we usually use, and they're about looking at that between person level, and ideographic methods are what ESM enables, and they're about looking at that within person change. And so if I'm going to use an ideographic method, what I need to do is sample the same person, this person one, across multiple observations, and then I can calculate a correlation between my variables of interest at every single time point. So this person, I've got threat and aggression, and I can look at the correlation between threat and aggression at each time point. But if I'm at a nomothetic level, what I would do is collect multiple persons and say, on average, how much threat do you feel? And on average, how much aggression do you show? And I would calculate a per person correlation. So this is a little overview of those two things. This kind of way of thinking, coming from many backgrounds, does take a little bit of getting used to. But I find it most useful for me to just think about, okay, this is about how I change above and below my usual level of things. And this is about how different people are different from each other. And the last advantage of ESM I want to talk about is the fact that we can assess over multiple contexts. So instead of just focusing on one particular situation, which we can construct in the lab, or multiple situations, which we can construct in the lab, we can look at the variety of everyday life. And if you follow people for a week, they tend to, not in COVID times perhaps, but in normal times, they tend to go through lots of different situations. And we're able to sample those situations. So we're able to look at how context moderates some of the effects we're interested in, but we're also able to get a much more robust understanding of our effect if it generalizes across all the different contexts of ESM. And another strength of this is that we will also have much more reliable measurement because we've got so many measurement points. We're able to aggregate them together to get a really nice, strong understanding of someone's mean. Okay, so now we're going to try and take Zoom to its next level, and we're going to try and pop you in a breakout room discussion. So before you begin that discussion, you're going to just be randomly assigned to a room of about 5 people. Do take the time to introduce yourself to the other people if you haven't already met. We have a big diversity of people here today, so hopefully you'll meet someone new. So what you'll be doing is filling a sort of this task here. So what we'd like you to do is think about the fact that you're working with another researcher, and that researcher wants to understand the relationship between social interactions and happiness. Your job is to convince that researcher to test their research question using experience sampling. So in your group, we'd like you to discuss how you might convince that person to use ESM to study the social interaction happiness link using those 4 different groups of advantages of ESM you've just learned. So the idea of this is to get you a bit used to thinking about the strengths of ESM and hopefully applying them to a particular research question, and hopefully having a bit of chat to each other so you're not too bored by hearing my voice for 2 hours. So Narissa's going to assign you to breakout rooms, and you'll have about 6 minutes, and then we'll pull you back in. So now I've sold you on ESM being the answer to all of our problems, hopefully, if I was convincing. Now I'm going to actually walk back from that a bit and tell you a little bit about what can go wrong. And it is a lot of things, and so I think it is important to really think about whether ESM is the best choice for your study before you dive in. The first thing is poor compliance. So when I say the word compliance, I am referring to the number of, or the percentage of completed momentary surveys. So on ESM, we might send people 70 surveys across a week, so 10 a day, and then we would measure how many of those surveys they did. And if they did 70 of them, they would have 100% compliance. Of course, it's pretty rare to get 100% compliance, and most studies sort of report between about 70 and 90% compliance. We want to make sure this is as high as possible because we want to make sure that we're really reflecting our participants' lives. But we also need to recognize it's rarely going to be 100%. And in fact, people who get 100% are a little bit strange. So you can imagine you're going to get surveys, we would usually do across the whole day. So let's say between 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. And in that time, you might drive your car or ride your bike, you'll be in meetings, you'll have a shower. And so if you miss a beep or miss a survey, that's life. And that's what we should recognize as researchers. There are some participants who go to intense lengths. So for example, I had a participant who got a special waterproof case for her phone so she could take it into the shower so she'd never miss a survey. But those people are few and far between, and they're probably not super representative of the population. So I think it's best to remember that people are people, and it's hard to do this. But in saying that, we need to make sure that our compliance is high and it's not systematic. So what I mean here is that people aren't not doing surveys when they're really super stressed, for example, because that varies with some variables we're interested in. And it would really be a problem if people were systematically skipping things because they were stressed. Now, if people are skipping things because they're driving or they're having a shower, that's less of an issue for us. So there's some studies of what increases and decreases compliance that I'm going to run you through so that we can think about how we design our studies to avoid these issues. So in 10 ESM studies, Aki Rantala and his colleagues looked at the systematic predictors of compliance. And what they found is that, unsurprisingly, compliance declined across the days of the study. So participants were doing more of the surveys early on than they were later in the game. And it was highest around lunchtime and lowest if you ran surveys early in the morning, which I think highlights the importance of figuring out what a sensible wake-up time is for your participants and starting your surveys at that time. They also did another set of this big analysis of existing studies. And in this one, they were looking at the momentary predictors of compliance. So what were you doing at this previous survey that predicts whether or not you'll comply with the next survey? And what they found here, which was kind of reassuring for those of us who research any of these things, were that momentary negative mood, stress, the context or situation the participant was in, and their physical state was not associated with their odds of completing the next survey. So that's good because it suggests that these things don't systematically lead to participants skipping surveys. But what they also found was that being outside of the home was negatively associated with the odds of completing the next survey. So if you're busy, you're doing activities, you're less likely to complete the next survey, which makes sense, but it's also a problem, for example, if you study something like social interaction where people are outside the home often, you may systematically miss some of the things you're interested in. In another study of compliance, Jessie Sun and her colleagues had 47 variables which they coded from audio snippets taken in daily life. And these audio snippets were taken while participants completed their ESM surveys. So what we could do is what the title of the paper is called, eavesdrop on why they might be missing the surveys. And what they found is of these 47 variables, very few of them significantly predicted missingness. And included in that were things like the emotionality of their speaking. So that was good for those of us who study emotion. But there were some predictors of missing a survey. So participants were more likely to miss a survey when they were around other people, when they were talking more, and when they were spending more time on a computer. So again, it seems to be indexes of things that could distract you from answering your phone. So I think here, this sort of moral of the story is to have a big think about what you're studying and how you can design the survey to be as less obtrusive as possible so people will feel comfortable quickly picking it up while they're doing things. But also just recognizing that this is always going to be an issue and you can't necessarily design your study around it. The second issue to think about is attrition. And attrition here, as in other disciplines, refers to the number of participants who drop the study completely, so who decide to discontinue their participation. This is more of an issue in ESM because it's a large time commitment. So if our typical study is 10 surveys per day for a week, that's quite a lot of time to have to spend on the study when often studies are just a half-hour survey. So what you would want to do to try and address this is brief your participants very thoroughly at the beginning about what's involved so that there's no nasty surprises once they start, and making sure you incentivize them to complete the study in some way. And so that is what we're going to talk about later. But of course, there is the concern that only motivated participants remain in the study by the end. And of course, motivated participants might not be representative of the population. So again, what we need to remember is to try and make our study as least burdensome as possible, so we actually get some sort of cross-section of the population. Our next big issue is reactivity. And when we talk about reactivity, what we are asking is whether the measurement affects the measured event. And of course, that's a problem for every one of us who does psychology and who does self-report methods. But it's a particular problem with ESM because doing repeated assessments of the same behavior across days and weeks might lead us to pay sort of an unusual level of attention to the way that we're acting, the way that we're thinking, the way that we're feeling, that we wouldn't have if we weren't constantly asked to reflect on that. And so this is one of the biggest challenges with ESM, I would say. So yeah, repeated assessments might lead us to pay more attention to our behavior and to engage in sort of more self-monitoring processes and more reflective processes. So for example, if I fill out an emotion measure 10 times a day, that might lead me to realize that I'm sad very often, but then I'm less sad when I spend time with my friends. And so with that new knowledge in mind, I might go out and have more social interactions, and then I might feel less sad. And that's fantastic for me, but it doesn't make my data super representative for the researcher. So we do need to think about how these monitoring processes might be at work. And indeed, self-monitoring is actually used as an intervention in a lot of fields, getting people to pay better attention to their own behavior. So this is something that is actually quite effective at making people feel better. So what do we do about this? Well, Barter, Tenen, and Litt suggests that one thing we could do if we're really worried about reactivity, and you must have to think about your study variables to think about whether this is a huge issue for you, is to include a control group. So to have a group of participants who don't do ESM, but do everything else, and then look at how they differ as a factor of doing ESM or not. That's, of course, a quite expensive and difficult solution. So one that's a little bit less difficult to do is to make sure that we examine all our data for time trends and for response shifts. So looking at things that are happening in our data that probably aren't attributable to things like just the change of time or the weekend coming in, for example, and seeing if there is systematic change across our data set. And here it's important to remember that you might not see a linear trend in your whole sample, but it may be that for some people, they're more reactive to ESM and some people are less. So here you also want to be looking at a per participant basis. Probably a bigger ethical issue for us to think about is whether our sampling negatively affects our participants. So if you're following someone around for a week and you're asking them constantly, how depressed do you feel right now? How sad do you feel right now? How angry do you feel right now? Is that something that's going to lead to some psychological trauma? And that, of course, is what we don't want to do. But the good news here is mostly this seems to be okay. So for example, in this study, they had participants randomly assigned to either report their negative emotions for a week, their positive emotions for a week, or a control group that just reported their internal states for a week. So things like hunger and thirst and stuff like that. And they found that there was no difference between those emotion reporting groups and that internal state reporting groups on their end of week well-being and their end of week depressive symptoms. So it seems like simply reporting on emotional things doesn't necessarily change how you see yourself and see the world after the study. But of course, that might depend on the person. So Tamlin Connor did this study where they had people report on their happiness either 1, 3, or 6 times a day. And what they found here is there was no effect of the frequency of happiness reporting on well-being outcomes. But that was different for people who were high in neuroticism or depressive symptoms. And for those people who were higher on neuroticism or more depressed, the more that they reported on their happiness, so if they're in that 6 times a day happiness reporting group, the more that negatively affected their mood. So this does suggest that we need to be a little bit sensitive about the questions that we ask and the samples that we use. But in saying that, ESM can actually sometimes help and act as a bit of an intervention. So in this study, they had people with depression, and those people reported on their emotions across an ESM period. And what they found was at the end of the period, those people reported higher emotion differentiation. What that means is that they were more able to label their emotions in a specific and granular way. So they were more likely to differentiate between sadness and anger and anxiety, rather than just saying, I feel really bad right now. And that's a skill that's associated with things like emotion regulation and with well-being. And so it does seem like ESM can sometimes function as a helpful intervention for these groups. But in general, there's no silver bullet for reactivity. And so I'd suggest having a big think about your constructs and your sample and making sure that you've done the best that you can, and then doing what Barta and colleagues suggest and really investigating your data at the end of things.
One question that just came through in the chat that I think might be relevant. So Williams asked, in addition to testing with control groups, could you also manipulate the frequency of sampling moments? For example, you could test whether greater frequency of reports has an effect on reporting of the variable. However, this might also be confounded with attrition.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting. I think it would be difficult to do if you were doing this correlationally. So if I had a sample and I had the degree to which they'd responded and I tried to correlate that with their outcomes, because as you say, it might be confounded with a bunch of other variables. So for example, a more conscientious person is probably more likely to fill out a bunch of these surveys, or someone who's more externally motivated by receiving the reward might fill out more surveys. And so that might hide any effect of the reporting on any outcome variable. But I think one way that we didn't discuss that you could do this is actually by manipulating frequency. So you could have one group of participants in a 5 per day survey and one group of participants in a 10 per day survey, and have a look at if that has an effect on results. And in some ways that's nicer than a control group, because you're still getting data from both groups, you're just getting more data from one group. And so that might be a good suggestion. Thanks for the question, William. Are there any others while I pause? Nope. Yeah, Pete has linked you to Connor and Reed, which does actually do this in their study. They have people report 1, 3, and 6 times a day. So the last issue I want to talk about is the fact that this kind of research, which you've probably already picked up, is time consuming and resource intensive. And that's both for you and for your participants. These studies are a lot of work, they're a lot of stress, there are a lot of money if you're paying people, and there are a lot of time in sending emails and setting up apps and dealing with big data sets. And because you've got your participants for usually a week or maybe 2 weeks, You can imagine the number of emails you get about a lab study where you're running them for an hour, and then multiply that by them being in it 7 days. So you do have a lot of that kind of support work to do. And I think people often pick up these studies without realizing that. So do make sure that if you're going to run a study, you're organized, you're well planned, and you're ready to deal with any issues that come up. And also have a think about your sample and whether they're ready to handle these kind of studies. If you are working with clinical groups, I don't know if anyone here is, there is a heap of research doing ESM with clinical groups, and they do seem to have good compliance, and they're interested in these studies. And I think often these kind of groups are more interested because they see this as a way to help themselves. So those groups actually respond well to ESM, but I've heard of people having difficulty sometimes with full-time workers and these kind of groups because it's quite difficult to respond to ESM during your workday. In those kind of situations, you may want to think about how you can make the kind of protocol quite less burdensome. I think I saw a question in the chat.
Oh, it's mostly just Pete being amazing, sharing resources for everyone. So
thank you.
I'm sure if they're not in your list, we'll add them to the FAQs at the end as well and make it available online.
Thanks, Pete. And to give some context to people who don't know, Pete co-directs the field lab and knows just about as much about ESM as me. I just like making pretty slides more, so this is why I'm doing this workshop. Okay, so if there's no other questions, I'll just pop onto the next part of this presentation, which is the different types of ESM designs. And again, we're going to introduce you to more jargon, but hopefully this will all make sense once we get into it. And I'm going to talk about 3 main types of designs. I should say that these aren't mutually exclusive. So you could have an aspect of all 3 designs within the same study. So if you see something that's really good for your study in one type of design, but it wouldn't answer everything or address everything, then you can kind of combine and chop and change a little bit. So to start, we have what's called an interval contingent or a fixed design. And this is sort of self-explanatory when you read fixed. The surveys are sent at fixed times during the day. So you say to yourself, I'm going to have 3 surveys per day. 1 will come at 9, 1 will come at midday, and 1 will come at 5 p.m. That would be a fixed design. The strength of these designs is that having a predictable kind of sampling protocol enhances your compliance. So people get used to the idea, the surveys come at 9, 12, and 5. And they go and they check their phones at those times and they're more likely to answer. The other issue that we won't get into too much today, but to know about is that when you do a fixed design, your observations are evenly spaced. So you have the exact same amount of time between each of them every single day. And that meets the assumptions of some analyses, some time series analyses. So if you're going to do something fancy, do have a look at the assumptions and have a think about whether you should do a fixed design. The limitations are probably already evident to you. If you have a really predictable time kind of setup, people get very used to that quickly, and it means that they start planning their day around when the sampling is coming. So they go, oh, it's almost midday, I have to do that survey. Let me just stop what I was doing and wait for it to come and then answer it. So you're not getting at that nice ecological validity that you're trying to get at with ESM. So that can be a problem depending on what you study. You also might end up with some selection bias. So if I always send that midday survey I talked about, my participants might always be at lunch. And lunch might not be very representative of what their day actually looks like. I might be getting them at sort of a high point. They might feel more positive. So I think that fixed designs have their place, but they're best used when you're interested in something that's temporally bound. So for example, you might be interested in circadian rhythms, and it's sensible and important for you to sample them. Candice, I'll get to in 1 sec. And something that isn't affected by preparation. So for example, people who study eating behavior, they might think, well, people are often going to eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner. That's probably not going to be super affected by these beeps or surveys in a normal sample. So I'm going to use a fixed schedule. Candice, do you want to ask your question?
I was just wondering if you wanted to have someone reflect on their whole day, you know, or if ideally you wanted data throughout the day, but you could really only measure them once. Would you ask them to do that at night? Is there any problems that you would see in, you know, asking someone to reflect on their day and having the survey open from 5 p.m. till midnight? Yeah.
So that's a diary study, right? And so that I would usually have them do it in the evening. So when I've done diary studies before, we often use 7 p.m. and we'll send the survey out at 7 p.m. and we'll ask them to complete it before midnight. And in that case, the timing and the precision becomes a little bit less important because you're interested in them reflecting on their whole day. So you're bringing in that reflective element already. And you just want to make sure you don't make the time too lagged. So that's why you'd say something like you said, like, please make sure you complete the survey before midnight. So yeah, in a diary design, I always would recommend doing a fixed design because that you're already introducing that element of reflection. And so you're less worried about the time and the precision. Is there anything else in chat? Nope, just Pete. So the second is a signal contingent or a variable design. And so in this type of sampling, the surveys are sent at a random or a pseudo-random time. So people can't know when they're coming. The strengths of this is that you get a more representative random sampling of events and context. So today my ESM surveys may come at like 8 a.m., at 3 p.m. and at 9 p.m. But tomorrow they may look very different, and you can get a sort of sense of what my life looks like across the day rather than fixing it to particular times. This also has potentially less measurement reactivity. So the participants can't kind of mentally plan for when the surveys are coming, and so they're potentially going to be less reactive to them. I think this is a debatable point, but it is something that people sometimes raise. The limitations are that it might reduce compliance. People have no idea when the survey is coming, so they're just going to keep living their lives, and they might start driving their car, and then your survey turns up and there's not much they can do about it. You'll also have unevenly spaced data. So if you use a fully random design, a survey may come at 10 and then a survey may come at 10:30 and then another survey may not come until 7 p.m. And so they're not spaced out, and that may violate some time series analyses assumptions. So what we often do, and what I'd say is the most common type of ESM design, is something called pseudo-random signal contingent. So what that means is that we divide our day up into intervals. So if I'm interested in sending 10 surveys, I'll divide it up into 10 intervals. And so I keep them sort of spaced apart, my intervals, and then I send each survey at a random time during those intervals. So in that way, I'm not accidentally bunching all my surveys in the morning and annoying my participants a lot and not getting a section of the day. But I'm also capitalizing on this variableness to make sure that my participants aren't constantly getting surveys at the same time. So that is generally what I would recommend doing if you're interested in doing this signal contingent design. The third type of design is an event contingent design. So in this design, participants initiate the surveys themselves in response to some sort of trigger. So for example, if you are interested in social interactions, you might say every time you have a social interaction, once it's done, please open the app and report in on how it went. The strengths of this kind of design is that you have potentially less measurement reactivity. The participants are not having to deal with your surveys when they can't deal with them. They're instead having a chance to pick up their phone later on and report in. You also have less unnecessary sampling. So if you're interested in something specific like social interactions, you're not there bugging participants all the time. Have you had a social interaction? Have you had a social interaction? You're instead waiting until that happens for them and then they're reporting in. So you don't end up with a bunch of data that you're not really interested in and don't need. It's also really good for rarer events. So there are some events that won't come up a bunch during a normal week. So for example, I have a friend who studies conflict in relationships, and generally healthy couples don't get into much deep conflict across the week, but there may be 2 or 3 times where they have a bit of a clash with their partner that she'd like them to report in. And so instead of buzzing them 5 times a day and asking them, did you have a fight with your partner yet? She asks them to report in when they do have a fight with their partner. So if you do study anything that's particularly rare or is likely to be rare in your sample, do think about this as an option. The limitations here are, the big one is your participant has to remember to initiate the survey. So you have to train them very carefully about what you want them to initiate in response to, and you have to rely on the fact that they actually will do that. So often people who do these kind of designs incorporate also a nightly or a couple of times a reminder saying, remember you're doing the survey, do remember to report in to us. Is there anything you missed reporting in today? To try and capture things that might be missed. The other issue is that your information is only retrospective. So if you're interested in what predicts a conflict with your partner, and you didn't assess pre the conflict with the partner, you can't see, oh, well, feeling stressed in the morning predicts conflict with the partner in the evening. So you need to kind of give a bit of a thought to maybe combining your event contingent protocol with one of the other types to capture that. So the kind of best use of this, which I've already hinted at, is measuring processes surrounding specific events or really infrequent events. But it is comparable to using a signal contingent design if you are trying to capture social interaction. So I was surprised by this because I thought participants wouldn't be great at actually remembering to report in, but it turns out they're better than we think they are. And so do give event contingent designs the thought if it's something that's relevant to what you do. So I'm just going to go through one more slide and then we'll have a little bit of a break.
There's just a question here. Can we tie the trigger to a biometric signal, for example, heart rate variability?
Oh, look at that. You've preempted my next slide. Thank you to whoever asked that question because you make me look super organized.
David.
Thank you. So yes, you can. I have never done this before. It's a newer option, but it is something that you can do. So for example, this paper by Katie Homan and her colleagues used heart rate to trigger a questionnaire about emotions. And importantly, this is heart rate in absence of movement. So it's not like you go for a heavy run and then you get asked about your emotions. It's if you sort of have a stressful heart rate response in your normal life. So this is a sort of useful and new method, but it can be kind of hard to link with self-report. And I think this is an issue in general, that psychophysiology doesn't necessarily index self-report processes the way that we think it does. So this paper by Van Heilem and his colleagues found that sampling situations based on the relative increase in skin conductance was not associated with psychological arousal. So in that particular case, it didn't seem like a useful protocol for them. But it is something that is increasingly being done. And I think it's a really cool way to have an event contingent design without having to rely on your participants. But I would caution that most apps don't have this option yet, and is something that would be kind of difficult to work out how to do. Just to briefly recap that. So the way I would have answered, which is not necessarily the correct way, is with Elise, you could consider doing an interval contingent scheme. So like a fixed scheme, since you can time around her sleep patterns. But it might be better to do an event contingent scheme and ask her to report in when she wakes up. So actually to use that design, and people are relatively good at things like sleep and wake up, identifying them. Or if you had great tech skills, you could use that design with psychophysiology and use an activity kind of monitor to notice when she's awake and then ask her then. Jim wants to understand about romantic couples. As we sort of discussed already, arguments are likely rare events. Of course, that depends on your sample, and it always depends on your sample. Sometimes people would want to recruit in couples going through a divorce or something. But this might be best as an event contingent scheme in a normal sample. And finally, May wants to understand how negative self-talk is related to emotions. Both emotions and negative self-talk are things that probably fluctuate a fair bit across the day. So in this case, I'd probably use a signal contingent design and send beeps randomly across the day. Okay, so moving on, we're going to start getting more into the nitty-gritty of how we actually run these studies. But first, I just want to talk about when you might actually use ESM. So when is it actually appropriate? Well, the first thing is you need to think about the time scale of the process you're studying. Are you studying a micro process or a macro process? So a micro process is something that fluctuates across hours or even days or weeks. So something like emotion that fluctuates a bunch is really suitable for ESM. But you might want to look into a more traditional longitudinal method if you're interested in something that changes across months or years, like, for example, education. And if you're interested in both, so for example, how emotions move with education, you might want to do a measurement burst design where you follow people for a year, say, and you do ESM at like 3 time points across the year. So you can combine the two. But it's useless to do ESM for something that's not a micro process, because then you're just going to get the same response or a similar response every time. And that's not particularly interesting. So it's a lot of work for nothing. Then also think about the type of construct you're looking at. So are you interested in experience, memory, or belief? And they're all valid types of self-report, but each is different. So experience might be something like, are you happy at the moment? And that's best for ESM. Memory would be, were you happy this month? And belief would be, are you generally a happy person? Given another example, you could ask, do you usually enjoy going to the movies? That's a belief. Did you enjoy yourself at the movies last week? Would be a memory. And are you enjoying yourself at the moment? But ask them while they're at the movies, and that would be an experience. So ESM is best for these experiences, but memory and belief are generally better off with other designs. So moving on to the kind of research questions you can answer with ESM. I'm going to give you a few example research questions of things that I think ESM is well suited for, but the list is obviously longer than this. And for each of these example questions, I've linked off to a paper that does that kind of analysis, so you can get a sense of what that might look like. So first up is how prevalent or frequent is an event or behavior? And I think this is a particularly suitable question for ESM. And it's also one that we often neglect as psychologists. So we might study something that we think is really interesting, but it's something that doesn't really occur in people's normal daily lives. And so this kind of question can help you get at whether the process you're studying is something that's meaningful to your participants. So in the example, this is a paper of mine, we were looking at the reasons why people regulated their emotions. And there was a theory that suggested it wasn't only to make themselves feel better, but they also regulated their negative emotions to do things like get work done or to improve their social relationships. So in this paper, we just asked people, why did you regulate your negative emotions? And we looked at how frequently they endorsed those other types of emotion regulation benefits. And we found that people actually did use these theoretical categories. So ESM is useful for this kind of stuff. An analogous question is how people think, feel, and behave on average. So we can, in this type of question, follow people into their daily life and map out the average thinking, feeling, and behavior patterns for a particular variable. So this Hoffman paper does this with self-control and the conflict between our goals and our desires, and just looks at the kind of average levels of these things and how the different types of desires occur in everyday life. Another ESM specific question is how much variance is within versus between people. So you'll remember I talked about this a bit earlier in this presentation, that people can vary from be different from each other, or they can vary within themselves. And so between a sort of trait would have a lot of between person variance, but a state would have a lot of within person variance. So this Fleeson paper is probably very familiar to those of you who are personality psychologists. What Fleeson did was look at personality using ESM, and he found that there is a substantial amount of personality variance within people. So people do change on things like extroversion and neuroticism across time. So this can be a really interesting way to understand your construct a little bit more. The next thing that people might look at are what are the patterns of change in a variable across time. And so there's a very popular field of research called emotion dynamics that does this with emotion. So for this particular paper, they looked at the construct of emotional inertia, which is how emotions are correlated with each other across time, and showed that people who had more correlations between their emotions across time were also more likely to have higher depressive symptoms. So understanding how your variable is related to itself in interesting patterns is a way that you can use ESM data. This is probably the most common research question, just using ESM to establish how two variables are related, but not only at the same time point, but also looking at these cross lags, so how variables predict each other across time. So in this case, they looked at emotion and emotion regulation strategies and showed that the emotion regulation strategy you use now can influence your emotion at the next time point, controlling for emotion and emotion regulation at the previous time points. The next thing you can look at is actually bringing in these person level variables from your questionnaires. So for example, someone's age or their clinical diagnosis, and relating them to the behavior in daily life, or looking at how these person level variables moderate daily life relationships. So this is a paper of mine, and we looked at how emotion differentiation, that variable I talked about a bit earlier, which is how specifically people label their emotions, moderated how well people could regulate their emotions in everyday life. So you can bring together these two different types of questions. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to get into is how you actually design one of these studies. And so we're going to get into a lot of different parameters here. I'm going to dump a lot of information on you that I hope will come in handy for those of you who are actually going to run one of these studies. The first question I often get from people, I haven't had it today, but this is like something people always ask me, how many questions can I ask in ESM? And this, one of the first ESM papers that was reprinted in 2014, suggested that you don't want to have something that'll take more than 2 minutes to complete. So what does it actually look like? Well, a good rule of thumb is 20 to 30 quick, simple items. I tend to use about 25 items as my cutoff, but that is a higher cutoff. If you have something that's more complex, you want to go lower. This paper compared 2 types of questionnaires, one that was 30 items and one that was 60 items, and found that that 60-item questionnaire was associated with more perceived burden, with lower compliance, and with more careless responding. So you really don't want to be getting into the realm of a 60-item questionnaire. Now, a caveat here is if you're doing a daily diary study. If you're only asking people once a day, I think it's pretty acceptable to get up to more like a 5-minute protocol with 60 items. But if you're asking people more than once a day, do really think about cutting it back down to 30 items. If you have more complex items, use less of them. So if participants are going to have to stop and think about your item for 30 seconds, you can't have 25 of those items. Be really careful with using survey branching. So you want to make sure that if you send participants off, so say I start with saying, have you experienced a negative event since the last survey? And they say no, but I'm only interested in negative events. I could send them to the end and send them off. But of course, participants learn reasonably quickly that if they say no, they don't have to answer all the items. So you're incentivizing a particular response. So make sure that your branches are the same size as each other. So what if you can't fit all the items you want? And you won't be able to. It's very depressing to do an ESM study because usually what I do is start by putting all the items down that I'd want, and then I have to go through and cut them. And it's really sad to cut the items that you spent a lot of time thinking about. But you won't get everything in one study. So one thing that I often do is use the baseline survey to assess additional constructs. So I have participants before they start ESM, I have them fill out a bunch of items in a baseline survey, and there it doesn't matter as much if it's long. You usually have about 40 minutes of their time, so you can add some constructs that might be interesting to you but didn't quite make the cut for ESM. And if you do find interesting stuff, that might suggest they should go as an ESM construct in the next survey. Another potential option is to use a planned missingness design to randomize in subsets of items from a larger set. So you might have 60 items and you just can't pick between them. You can have a design that pulls in random subsets of those items, and so people get a different set of items at each time point. This does have implications for your analyses, but it is a more common and more popular method than it used to be, and I've got a little reference there about it if you're interested in doing it. Just check the chat. So how many days should my study last? Well, typically you want to use at least 7 days so you capture all the weekdays. And that's because almost every psychological variable I've ever seen is better on the weekend. So if you don't have weekends in there for some participants, but you do for others, it ends up being a mess. So if you do 7 days, it doesn't matter which day you start participants on, you'll have all 7 in your sample. It's also important to note that longer durations do decrease compliance, at least in the data that I've seen, but we do get reasonable compliance up to a month. Mostly I would do a week, maybe 2 weeks if I'm interested in a longer term phenomenon, but do remember that participants get sick of this pretty quickly. And do make sure you think about your effects in this design. So those of you studying alcohol use might want to involve more weekend days, but people who are studying the workplace might only be interested in weekdays. So it does depend on what you study. How many times a day should I sample? Well, that depends a lot on the variable. More is not always better. Some things aren't going to change over short time periods. Some things don't occur often. It seems silly to ask people about things like, how did you sleep 10 times a day? But it might be more sensible to ask about something like emotions 10 times a day that do change. So you do need to balance off these two things. But if you're studying a phenomenon that's characterized by rapid or frequent change, you do need to consider having more surveys. Otherwise, you might miss changes. And if you have surveys that are quite far apart, a whole bunch of stuff might have happened in the middle that you won't capture. And that's a shame for your data. So the typical study will have between 4 and 10 surveys per day, with the exception of something like a diary method, which is usually focused on 1 per day. This same study had 3, 6, or 9 surveys per day for 14 days, and they found no association between the frequency of sampling and these variables of burden, compliance, or careless responding. So it seems like people tolerate up to 9 surveys per day pretty well. So do balance the amount of times per day with your study duration. If you have a lot of surveys, you want to put fewer questions and you want to have a shorter study duration. So this study by Ebner Prima had EMA surveys every 10 minutes, but the survey was really brief and the study only lasted 24 hours. If you're doing every 10 minutes, you probably can't push it past the day. There are a few other little things to think about when you're scheduling. One is the start and the end point of the day. So you might want to do 10 a.m. to 10 p.m., for example, to get the whole day, but you have some participants who want to go to sleep at 8:30 or 9, or some participants who aren't up until 11. So you do need to think about what suits your sample. You can have different start and end times for participants, but just make sure their sampling period is the same length. So if you want to do 12 hours, you could ask me what my wake up time is and then time it around that, and then ask someone else and time theirs around their wake up time. The other thing to think about is the interprompt interval. So this is the interval between surveys. So even the random designs we talked about that send surveys in a random interval or at a random time often specify that there has to be a certain number of minutes between surveys, because otherwise you might get a situation where a survey comes in the previous window at 11 a.m. and then the next window starts and a survey turns up at 11:05. And that's not particularly interesting data for you, and it's super annoying for the participants. So you might want to say there must be at least 30 minutes between surveys. A long interprompt interval is associated with a lower compliance though, and that's perhaps because it leads participants to sort of forget about or disengage from the study. So if I get a survey at 10 a.m. and I'm doing this thing on my phone and then I don't get another survey until 10 p.m., I may have sort of forgotten about it already and disengaged. The last bit of timing to think about are the response or timeout windows. So participants will open your app and then sort of forget about it. So you want to make sure that you time them out of the survey after a certain point. So you want to think about that per item and then per survey. And you also want to think about how long they have to actually start the survey. And this is important because people may strategically delay your survey. So if you're studying something like stress, participants get the survey and they have an hour to complete it. They might just wait until they're a little bit less stressed to pick up and do the survey. And so you don't want to leave those times to be too long, but you also want to leave enough time that participants actually have the time to pick up the phone and do it. Especially if you've got something like a working sample, you want to make sure that they can stop what they're doing and do the survey. Just check the chat. Are there any items that you recommend always measuring in a baseline survey from Josh? Well, I always would do the ones that we always do in normal, like non-ESM studies, like age and gender and demographics, like you mentioned. I often put in Big 5 personality because it is always interesting to look at how things like conscientiousness predict survey compliance. But there's nothing that has to go in there. Just one thing I always suggest doing is that if you're using a phone app, you ask people what type of phone they have in that baseline survey so that you can deal with any weird tech issues that come up. Rose, do you think ESM would be effective for much shorter periods, e.g. 1 hour? Definitely. It just would depend what you were interested in. So you could, for example, I've seen studies looking at like museum experiences using ESM and giving people the phone or the app as they walk through a museum to report in. And so there, I think that would be interesting to do. You just have to think about how difficult it's going to be and how many beeps or surveys you'll do. So if you have only an hour, you may want to think about a really short sampling protocol and then reasonably often. Cool. I was going to have a breakout room discussion here, but we're going to run a bit short on time, so I'm going to forge ahead. But if you do want to do this later, this fictional person, Maria, has a really terrible ESM study planned and you need to fix it for her. She's obviously not thought this through. And so if you want to do it later, I'm sure she'd appreciate your feedback. So now I'm going to move on to sample size and power. There was a question about this earlier, so hopefully this slide will answer your question. Power depends in ESM on both the number of participants and the number of time points you have, which makes it much more complex. But something that people often think with ESM is that they can ask, because they ask people a lot of times, they cannot have very many people in their study. But after a certain point, and this is a simulation study from Bolger and Lowenthal, adding time points stops helping your power, but adding subjects is important to your power. So here you can see that the more that you add participants, the bit more power you have. So you can't just sample 10 people and sample them 100 times and say, oh yeah, but I have 10,000 points in my data set. You do need to consider the fact that you're always nesting within people, so you need to have a sensible amount of people in your design. So how do you calculate it? Well, there's 3 options I'm going to offer you, but often people have kind of avoided dealing with the power issue in ESM, so these are all relatively new things. The most simple option is to use the T method, and this is a link to that paper, and it argues that having a T value is often enough to calculate power for an ESM design, and so you can use then something like G power to calculate your power. There's 2 more complex options. One is running a simulation. So there's a package in R that will help you do that, but you do need to know a reasonable amount about the data you're going to collect to run it. So that's the more complex option, but probably the best option. And the third option is this brand new, like literally last week, I think this preprint came out, Shiny app that they've developed that you can plug in the data and they will generate you a power analysis. So this is going to be a little more complicated than this one because they do ask for a lot more specifications than you would usually have to think about. So you need to think about samples at every level and think about various different aspects of your model, but it is probably a good medium between running a simulation and doing the simple option. Yeah, but the thing I'd leave you with here is that you can't rely on having lots of measurements to replace having lots of participants. So now I'm going to switch gears to talking about formulating items. So measurement validation is something that's really lacking in ESM design, and indeed in a lot of social psychology at least. And because we don't have very much space to measure our constructs, if we go with 25 items, researchers will often make up items because we just can't use a full scale when we don't have that much space to put the scale in. So I'm going to hopefully show you how to write your own items in a sensible way, but also leave you with some sources that might help you avoid having to do that. So some guidelines to think about. You want to have the most simple wording possible. No jargon, no long words, simple, easy. Write it like a participant would explain it. And it's really tempting for us to use our psychology words, but like, for example, I often study something called rumination. Most participants don't know what rumination is. So I would never say, how much did you ruminate since the last survey in English, at least, because rumination is not a word participants would use. Write items objectively when you can. So instead of asking in a kind of loaded way, ask about specific behaviors participants might have done. This is really important when you're looking at more clinical samples and you're trying to get at symptoms, to phrase the symptoms in a behavioral way instead of in a way that could be perceived as negative. Your items should be really concrete, so no abstract airy-fairy things. This is really important for ESM, including the time frame. So you might ask, how happy are you? But you want to say, at the moment, how happy are you? Or since the last survey, how happy have you been? So anchoring them to a time frame so you can set up your models correctly and you're capitalizing on these benefits of ESM. Avoid items that require a lot of reflection and thought. This is meant to be something that participants can pick up and do during their normal lives. So as they're sitting on the bus, as they're at work, and so they don't necessarily have time to sit there for a few minutes and reflect on their own selves and behavior. Make sure your items vary over time. So obviously you wouldn't ask people 10 times a day for a week, how old are you? That's an extreme example, but there are a lot of constructs that don't vary all that much, and it's a waste of your time and your participants' time to ask about those. Use multiple items per construct when you can. It's tempting to assess 25 different constructs with your 25 different items if you have them. Don't do that. Try and use multiple items per construct for things that matter to you. Make sure you have items that occur often enough in daily life. So you don't want to be asking participants like, I don't know, have you had a huge stressor today? Lots and lots of times, because it's not something that really occurs for them very often. Or right now you might not want to ask, have you been to class today? Because most people aren't going to class right now. So make sure you have items that are representative, otherwise participants are going to get kind of bored and annoyed by you. Make sure you use momentary and not trait-like assessment. So you want to say something like, I feel angry right now, and not, I am an angry person. So everything here is asking about experiences and states and not about traits. You want to avoid extreme wording so you capture this variability. So I'm asking about anger, but of course, if you think back on your own lives, most of you wouldn't have felt very strong anger over the past day, for example. But if I asked you if you were irritated or frustrated, you might have been able to endorse those items. So sometimes in ESM, it's useful for you to use less intense versions of the same variables. And the final thing I want to say here is to avoid double construct items. So my example here is, I felt unhappy at work. That's not necessarily a bad item, but in ESM, you could ask them, how unhappy do you feel right now? And then, are you at work right now? And then you could look at the correlation between the two and use that correlation to predict other things. And so you're not asking participants to reflect on when they felt unhappy, you're actually testing that. So that's the beauty of ESM. And that's why it's important to kind of write your items in this very straightforward way. I'm just going to quickly check the chat. What effect size should we use for ESM study results? Well, I would suggest you read the power papers because, yeah, it's, or do you mean the actual results themselves? That's actually also a big issue because there's this within between person stuff. Effect size is not necessarily straightforward. There is a few different options. If you email us or when you fill in the survey, I can send you out a paper that looks at power for ESM and multi-level models that was published in Psychological Methods last year, but I can't remember the name of the first author. If anyone in the chat knows, feel free to chuck it in there. Otherwise, I'll find it for you if you shoot me an email. Cool. And thanks, Josh has just noticed that there's a wrong link in my slides, so I'll just fix those up and send them around when I fix the link. So thinking about timeframes. So this is something that's unique to ESM. So as I said, we want to make sure we direct participants to what they're actually thinking about when they're answering these questions. And generally the best use of ESM is this right now, at the moment, or currently stuff. So we're actually grabbing that moment in experience, but there's no recall bias. They're just answering the question. But that's not always possible. So you might want to use since the last survey to capture things that are ongoing constructs or less frequent behaviors. So if you're interested in people's social interactions, you could ask them right now, are you in a social interaction? But you might not capture all of them. So instead you could say, since the last survey, have you had a social interaction? You're introducing a little bit of recall bias, but you're gaining the ability to see much more of the day. In a specific time interval. So this can be useful for some particular constructs. So something like sleep quality, how did you sleep last night? That would need to have that specific time interval. So if there may be some constructs that require this kind of wording. Do be careful if you use since the last survey, since it limits how you can use that variable to predict other variables. So let me give you this little picture which helps. So if I ask since the last survey, I'm capturing this bit of experience, and then I'm reporting in and you're asking these right now options. So say I'm interested in, I've asked people, how much did you suppress your emotions since the last beep? And I want to use that to predict emotion. So I probably want to know about suppression here to predict emotion here, but of course I'm answering these since the last beep items at the same time as I'm answering these right now items. So the wording is lagging them in time, but I can't do that in my model. And so that's not as strong of a model. But it wouldn't make any sense for me to use suppression back here to predict emotion over here, even if this is the previous survey and this is the current survey, because I'm asking about suppression way back here, and there's this whole interval that's happened since then. So do have a think about when you write those items, how you actually want to use them in your statistical models, what you want to predict each other, and how you might want to use previous and current time points, because you can make it difficult for yourself if you word them in certain ways. Again, I was going to have a breakout room here, but I'm going to skip on through so we can make sure we have enough time. These are some crappy ESM items that I was going to have you rewrite to be a little bit more effective. So if you want to have a go at that later, feel free. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is response scales. And the kind of response scales you can use: multi-choice, open-ended, slider. There are as many as you can use in other self-report measures. So I'm not going to recommend one over the other. We often use slider scales in ESM because participants seem to find them relatively intuitive, and because they often run from 0 to 100, you can capture variability a little bit better than you can with a Likert scale. But I don't think that there's any real push to use any particular type of response. What I would say is it's good to be consistent within your survey where possible, so your participant isn't having to get used to a bunch of different scales, because they will start doing this quite quickly. And so you want to go with that rather than against it. And be really careful with open-ended responses. Participants hate having to fill out text boxes in ESM, and sometimes you have to do it. But if you do have to do it, make sure you sort of say that you'll accept short words or text or whatever. And do be aware that if you have anything open-ended, you will end up with like 70,000 of these momentary reports to go through and code that open-ended data. And so it can be a lot of work. You also might want to think about the order of items. So here, the most important consideration is how putting questions might influence each other. So if you ask first up, what was the worst event since the last survey? And then you ask, how do you feel right now? You're getting participants to have their how do you feel right now colored by that worst event that just happened. So you might want to flip around the order of those, because this one can influence this one. Kim He et al. Has a good set of suggestions for ordering within a survey. The first thing that they suggest is that you want to put more transient experiences up front, or those that can be influenced by the recall of other experiences. So in my studies, I always put emotions up first because they're very transient and they're very easily influenced. And then you might move to more stable experiences. So then I would ask items like, where are you right now? Who are you with right now? That they can answer and are about now, but aren't likely to be influenced by answering about their emotions. And then finally, I'd put the more reflective items, or our since the last survey items. So they go last because they've already sort of been tarnished by retrospection. So it's easiest to just allow that to happen and put them towards the end. As far as randomization goes, what I often do is randomize within blocks of items on the same construct. So I'll have 10 emotions and I'll randomize the order of emotions within that block, but not across the whole survey. And I do that because participants get kind of used to the order of the survey and it helps them to respond. So I think having it not be too random helps with compliance. But of course, the nicest thing statistically would be true randomness. So weigh those two things off against each other. So where can you get these kind of items? Well, there didn't used to be a lot of stuff, but it's more and more coming out now, which is nice. So this ESM item repository is a really lovely resource put together by Olivia Kirtley that everyone has submitted their ESM items, and you can search by construct and grab other people's already written items. So there's a link there and you can go have a look if you like. You can write your own items for the study. Then I would suggest that you try and validate them in pilots if you can, because there's nothing worse than doing a big costly data collection and then finding out the scale that you wrote ad hoc has no reliability. So it's best to spend a lot of time making sure that's correct if you can. You can adapt items from validated trait questionnaires, but make sure you reword them to have state wording. So I might grab a self-esteem item that's like, you know, I value myself as a person, but it would say right now, I think I'm a valuable person. You can do this by picking the highest loading items from their factor analyses, but do make sure that you note that some items are really hard to adapt to be state wording. So have a go at this, but be aware. And there are some scales that have been published that have been validated for ESM. I'd say they're fewer and further between, but they definitely exist. So this is an example from our own lab by Haley Medland for emotion regulation, and this is an example of a validated within-person mood scale. So one thing I'd say here is to try and remember that you have a pretty costly data collection going on. So I usually would try and have multiple research questions assessed if I can. So either I will have multiple research questions in mind before I start data collection, or I'll team up with someone else from my lab or a collaborator to put multiple questions in there. So that's something to think about doing if you have a lab that's interested in these kind of things. I also tend to include extra questionnaires in the baseline survey, which allows me to do exploratory analyses or future secondary data analyses. So these are some papers that we've recently published that use secondary data analysis on a bunch of different ESM studies that we've collected. So this is a really nice thing to do. And if you have some space in your baseline questionnaire, I usually would put in some scales that I just think are always useful or interesting. And then later on, sometimes you think, oh yeah, well, what I should do is look across these 3 data sets I've collected to see what this scale does. And then you can use that data again. So I've talked a little bit about the importance of incentivizing participants. This is really important in ESM because it's a huge time commitment. And so you need to recognize that and keep your participants happy. So the first option is obviously payment. We generally incentivize based on a scheme that rewards numbers of surveys completed. So we would say you get the full amount of payment if you do 80% of the surveys, and then you get a certain amount of dollars less for every 10% less completed, to try and get participants excited and into completing the surveys. But just make sure you don't make the full amount of money contingent on 100%. You need to recognize that some surveys need to be missed and will be missed. And if you say it has to be 100%, you'll get participants giving you nonsense responding because you've beeped them while they're driving, so they quickly pull over, they answer it as quickly as possible, and they don't actually put thought into it. So I usually use 80% as my cutoff. 80 or 85 or 75 all make sense. The other incentive that I think is really useful is personalized reports. So this is an intrinsic motivator because people love their own data, and it is actually reasonably easy to calculate a little report of participants' data across the ESM period. You can do this with R Markdown if you have some R skills, or some software has a feature embedded that does reporting. So our own software, SEMA 3, has a personalized reports feature, and you can just turn it on at the end of the week, and participants can look at little graphs of what their data look like across the week, which most participants really like. It's sort of like a Fitbit for your emotions. Another really important incentive is having a responsive and pleasant research team, and that team that's keeping an eye on compliance and checking in with participants and answering emails. I think the benefits of that can't be overstated. And of course, make sure participants understand the importance of the study. So really explain to them why you're doing the study and why you need them to respond so often. So here's some stuff on apps and software, because obviously you can't just run these studies using your usual survey software. There's 3 different options I've listed here. One is participants have their own phones, and then you install an ESM app on their phone. This is really useful because it doesn't require internet. It's easy to guarantee the notifications arriving on time and to measure time in the app, and you can set it up to fit your study design. The biggest disadvantage is compatibility issues, particularly with Android phones. There's a lot of different forms of Android in the world, so that often breaks things. Participants can more easily play with the notification settings because it's their phone, so they have control. And some participants don't like putting apps on their phone because they feel like it's not private. Another option is having research phones in your lab that are set up just for doing ESM that you hand out to participants. There's also apps that do that. That's good because you can include participants without phones, or like older populations like we were talking about before. You have a bit more control over what's displayed. So if you need really precise stimulus presentation, this is probably a better option for you. And you can set it up so it's really hard for participants to avoid the notifications. They can't play with the settings. The disadvantage of this, of course, is that you have to buy hardware for your lab, and participants have to carry an extra phone, which they might find a bit irritating or they might forget. The third option, which I have a little less experience with, is using a web tool that sends text messages with survey links to participants. So something like Survey Signal does this. This is easier to set up because most of us know how to program a web survey in Qualtrics or Lime Survey or similar. And it also means you have less compatibility issues across devices, but it's also much less standardized across participants. You have a lot less control over when participants access and do the survey. And you can't tell, for example, how long they spent on pages and this kind of thing. And your data can be quite messy. But this sort of web tool is usually what I would use for a daily diary study. So usually I would set up emails to go out with Qualtrics links if I was just doing one measurement point a day. Briefly moving through, so there are many, many, many apps and software for this kind of stuff out there. This is a Google Sheet started by Ruben Aslan. It has a list of many of them. A lot of them cost money, which is great if they do what you want. But these are 2 free options that don't require you to code and both have online videos to get you started. So the app that we run out of the field lab, mostly run by Narissa Dozo and Pete Cavall, is SEMA 3, and it's free, works on Android and iPhone, and it's designed to be installed on participants' own phones. So check that out if you're interested. The other option is out of my old postdoc lab in Leuven. It's called MobileQ. It's an Android app, and it's designed to be installed on cheap Android phones that you purchase in the lab. So the last little bit I'm going to talk about here is pre-registration. There is now finally a template for ESM studies, because if you've ever tried to use as predicted or something for an ESM study, it doesn't work out super well for you. And this is really nice if you're doing your very first study, because it walks you through these methodological steps and asks you about the decisions you've made at every single point. So I would recommend having a look at it, even if you're not pre-registering. There's also this template for existing data. So that might be useful to you because ESM data sets are quite large, and so you might come back to it to answer some different questions that you didn't actually have in mind in the first place. And so that allows you to pre-register those new analyses. And I want you to think really carefully about these issues in ESM, because the amount and the complexity of the data makes it really easy for you to go down a garden of forking paths. So it's really hard to not think, oh, well, actually, I've got this as a control variable, or maybe I should run this model. And so there's many different analytic choices you can make. And this is a really nice paper that gets a bunch of different analysts to analyze the same data set, and they all make different analysis choices. So it's good for you to think about it in advance if you can. I'm just going to quickly check the chat.
Josh has a question.
Okay, so Josh says, do you get similar rates of compliance when you use lab phones rather than personal phones? So we've only done this in my old postdoc lab in Belgium. In Belgium, we found we had higher compliance when we used the lab phones. And I think that's because there's no tech issues, because they're all exactly the same. And so we've tested the crap out of them. And you can't turn off notifications, so participants can't sort of escape them. But I think that would depend on the context a little bit. Like, I think Australians might be a little more resistant to carrying around a second phone. And the difference in compliance is about 5%, so it's not a big one. So I wouldn't change my study based on that.
Hi everyone, we know that we had to rush through a couple of those last slides as we realised there's a lot to cover when you start getting into experience sampling methods. So in order to give you the full-fledged benefit of everything, we've decided to record an extra session just covering those last couple of slides as well and tacking it onto the first presentation. We hope you enjoy, and again, I thank Elise so much for all her time. All yours.
Hi, everybody, and congratulations if you've gotten to the end of this video. I'm very proud of you. So I'm just going to run through these last few slides that are focused on study logistics and a little bit on data analysis. So to pick up where we left off, study logistics, I already said this when I was rushing through the slides at the end last time, but one of the most important things you can do in ESM research is extensively pilot test your protocol. So we do this in a two-step way usually. The first is that you and other researchers in your team complete your own studies as if you're a participant. I find this really helpful because it gives you a sense of how burdensome ESM is for your participant, which is important if you've never been in one of these studies or run one of these studies. And it also gives you a sense of if your items make any sense to you in everyday life, or if they're things that actually don't often occur in your normal daily life. So this is the very first step. And usually at this step, you'll pick up a few issues. And then the second part of stage one is if you have kind of helpful and willing friends and family, have them test out your study for you. And this is really important because sometimes we tend to use jargon that doesn't make a huge amount of sense to people who aren't psychologists or researchers. And so this stage lets you pick up if you're doing that. And as we discussed in the measurement phase, having measurements that make sense to your participants is really important in ESM in particular. And then stage two is running first a very small batch of participants. So usually we would start with about 5 people. And this gives you a chance to see if everything works okay for you. If it does, then you include those participants in your final data collection. And if it doesn't, you scrap the study, you fix everything, get rid of those participants and start again. And so you're sort of starting everything off, but in a quite low cost way. So we always use these 2 stages, and I think it's a really important sort of step in ESM. So next up, I want to give you a little bit of an idea of what the flow of the studies would look like. So we usually start by recruiting our participants. And here we usually set up a website with some information. And on that website, we're super clear about the time commitment required. And we also list some eligibility criteria. So here it's really important if your software doesn't work on certain types of phones to list that kind of thing. Anything like that should be here. So you want to make sure you only get participants into the study who understand what they're signing up for. On this page, we also highlight the incentives. So the reasonably good payment or personalized reports if we're offering them. And we have a screening survey to make sure that we only sign up people who fit our criteria. So sometimes because these studies do pay a little bit more, you will end up with participants who try to do it anyway. So it's good to screen those people out. And the screening survey also allows us to kind of filter out some people who don't seem to be super committed. So we often sign participants up. We've just started using Qualtrics quotas to have participants sign up for their baseline session, and that automatically fills the session once you have enough people in. So that's a nice automated way that is already present at a lot of universities. Another option is Doodle, who can do much the same thing. So once you have recruited your participants, the next thing that we usually do is run a baseline session. We usually do this the day before the experience sampling period starts. So we've briefed them, they're all ready, they have the study in their mind, and the next day they begin. Usually we would do this in person because then we can kind of gauge participants' commitment and we can sort of form a relationship and answer their questions and these kind of things. In Corona times, obviously that's less feasible, and with some sorts of populations it might be less feasible. But in person if it's possible, and we have participants come into our lab in small groups, we brief them with a little slideshow about the study. They do our baseline questionnaires or whatever lab tasks that we're including. Usually that takes about 40 minutes. And then at the end, we take participants one-on-one through actually using the app with our questionnaire and answering any of their questions. So really supporting them through the first time they've done the survey. Online, we email participants a link to this baseline survey that includes the briefing videos, which I included some examples, or will include some examples of in a future slide. So we're trying here to recreate the experience of them getting some information from us, but it's not exactly the same as in person. So after they've done our baseline, the next day, they usually start ESM. During this, we have a dedicated study inbox. So we usually set up a Gmail and we have a roster in our team for monitoring it. It's really important to respond quickly to things like tech issues or concerns from the participants. Otherwise, you might lose data because the clock is ticking. So if their phone breaks and you don't respond to it till the next day, you lose all the data from that day, for example. You want to keep an eye on whatever platform you're using to make sure the data is being received. It's obviously a huge problem if your data isn't coming through, and tech issues can come up a lot in these studies. And you want to make sure you don't have too many participants at once, keeping it manageable. So usually we would aim for about 20 or 30 at once maximum. I did once run a whole study simultaneously because I was timing it around an event. So we had about 100 participants going at once, and it does become pretty burdensome. So just keep an eye on that. And during this time, you want to be keeping an eye on the compliance of your participants. Usually software platforms allow you to do this, and sending out reminder emails if it drops below whatever threshold number you've sent. So if we see participants do less than half of their surveys in a certain day, we might send them an email. And then once it's done, you want to make sure participants have synced all of their data. So sometimes they use devices that don't connect well to the internet, or they delete the app. So you just need to make sure they've done this for the last time. You organize, obviously, their payment or credit and their personalized reporting. And then sometimes people include a follow-up questionnaire in their study protocol, usually if they're interested in something that varies at a more macro level than ESM. So for example, people who study clinical symptoms might not be interested in the moment-to-moment variation, but they might be interested in the change across 2 weeks. And so this would be a good time to assess that. So the next thing we want to think about is how we're actually going to brief our participants. So as I've kind of highlighted throughout this session, ESM studies are really burdensome. And so it's our job to make things as easy on participants as we possibly can. And this is not just about how we design our study, so having good items, making it clear, not including too many items, but how we actually execute and run our study. So I'm going to go through how we've done this in our lab and some tips for you. So as I said, you need a good briefing session before the study starts. In this session, you've got to outline exactly what is expected for your participants. As I've said, we show them how to use the app one-on-one. We have them complete this practice version of the ESM survey with us and answer any questions that come up. And I usually do this by first showing a slideshow that explains exactly how the app works and walks through all the question types and expectations. I mentioned this before the experience sampling period begins. And I also have an FAQ document. When I was doing testing in person, we would hand out a copy of that as well as giving them a link. Online, we just have a link that we send in the first email. And this reiterates the most important information and encourages them to get in touch if they have any questions. And usually ESM surveys allow you to, ESM survey apps allow you to include a demo survey or an example survey in your application. And so I direct that to them and direct them to that and say if they do actually want to go through their survey and show it to their friends, which sometimes they do, particularly if you're sort of assessing first-year research participants who might want to refer their friends into your study. I say make sure you do it in that demo survey. You don't want them to have their friends actually filling out data for you. And I make sure in this session, it's super clear that me and the research team are open to questions or concerns that they have. And I try and generate enthusiasm for the study. So they have to feel like you're approachable and that you actually want them to be there and that their data is important to you. Of course, doing this online is a little bit harder. We've run a lot of daily diary studies online with 1 measurement per day. That's a little bit less commitment because participants just need to sort of check in once a day. But recently we have run some ESM studies successfully on Prolific, which is an online data collection platform. And we are running our usual undergraduate community sample ESMs this year with online briefing. So there is one study that shows that data quality is comparable to in person. So in a study on HIV risk behavior among men who have sex with men, so it's a specific sample, they found that their online data collection was just as reliable and valid as data collected in person. So hopefully this means good things for online ESM, but we'll see how we go this year. So we have been running online and we use briefing videos to convey some of that information that would have been that lab slideshow I talked about earlier. So I've given you 2 links to 2 briefing videos that we're using in a current study. The first is a briefing video on using our phone app SEMA 3 that was compiled by Narissa and Katie. And then the second is a briefing video on the study content of a study that my honours students, Rachel and Emma, are running this year. So those are both good examples of the kind of info you might include. But I'm just going to briefly go over the kind of info that I'd include because I think having this kind of stuff is useful to make your study slideshow or your study video when you actually get to this point. So I make sure I highlight survey timing so people know exactly the day that surveys will start, the time frame they'll occur in, like 10 a.m. to 10 p.m., how many they should expect, let's say 10, whether they're random or fixed. So we could say something like there's a random number of surveys that occur across the day, approximately how often they'll arrive. And this is really important because otherwise participants might be like, oh, why haven't I received a survey yet? But actually they should expect up to 5 hours between surveys. So you should make it very clear when there might be a tech issue if they're not getting surveys, as well as how long before each survey expires. So you can set this in most apps. For example, in our survey, it might be a half hour, and participants need to know they've only got a half hour after they hear that notification to fill out the survey. Otherwise, they will miss it and they will wonder why they didn't get a chance to fill it out. We include some reminders about responding. So here, it's important that participants are reminded to respond promptly, but also that we note it's okay to miss a few surveys and it's better to do that rather than to rush the surveys. If you really push for 100%, you will get participants freaking out and just rushing through and not answering the surveys properly. And so it's good to set the expectation that you know that they're going to miss a few and that's okay. But do highlight that if they systematically miss surveys, it makes their data unusable and that they might not receive the payment or the credit that they'd expect. So kind of both those things need to go in there. I often will include example questions. So I usually include 1 item of each type that I have in the study to show them what the items actually will look like. So I'll have 1 sliding scale item, a text entry item if I have 1 of those, a multiple choice if I have 1 of those. So they can see how they work and I can explain how to actually respond to them. And also at this point, you want to explain any items that could be confusing at all, that could be a little bit unclear. Hopefully you don't have too many like that in your survey, but if you do, it's good to emphasize those. You also want to demonstrate your app features, and that's particularly important if there's anything confusing. So here you could explain how to access the demo survey. If you have surveys that are event contingent, you could explain how they actually might report in for those. Anything that sort of seems relevant to working the app, you should explain here. You might want to define your terms, and one that comes up often here is explaining what you mean when you say right now. So I might ask, right now, how happy do you feel? Now, of course, I don't want them to rate how happy they feel while they're actually looking at their smartphone, filling in the item. when I say right now, I mean just the moment before the survey appeared. And so that's good to emphasize to your participants. A reminder of the incentives that you're giving and whatever they must do to achieve them. And so this is important, especially if you have a payment scheme that's contingent on completing a certain amount of surveys. You want to make it clear to participants that they need to do a certain thing to receive that payment. You want to give them some info on where to find more. So we often have a participant FAQ document. Something like that is really helpful so that they can go and look somewhere if they get a bit confused. But of course, they can also email you. And you want to emphasize that you're available to answer their questions. And it's important to you that they ask you things if they don't understand. So that segues me into communication, which is the last thing to think about with logistics. You will get a lot of emails while these studies are running. And so it's really important to have that under control. So like I said before, we set up a dedicated email address that the whole team on the project can see. Then we have a schedule about who monitors that email, and we're very responsive so we don't lose anybody confused. And what we usually do is write a set of form emails for our participants and have a plan on when we'll send them. So we have a bunch of emails written and we just need to change in the details. So participants get a baseline study email that reminds them what they need to do and where they need to go. They'll get an email at the end of day one, thanking them for doing day one and saying that we're receiving the data okay and that they can get in touch if they have any issues. We have low compliance emails that go out if they fall below a certain completion percentage or they miss a certain number of surveys in a row. It really depends on what your particular study looks like and what your participants are like, how you set this up. But it is good to have to sort of try and get back in participants who may sort of drift away from the study. And then we send them an email, obviously, at the end of the study. And it's really important here to make sure you thank the participants. We give them their personalized report. We give them information about when and how they'll be paid. And we explain how to uninstall the app if they've installed an app on their own phone. So the very last section I'm going to talk about is data analysis. And I don't have the time to get into data analysis too deeply, but I'm going to go through a few basics to get you used to these kind of data. And I'm going to give you a lot of resources that will help you get started. So the first thing to think about is what ESM data actually looks like. So in your typical study that you might do in the lab, you would have one row per person. And those two people would be 2 rows of your data set. But of course, in ESM data, you have lots of time points nested within people. And what that means is that the data aren't independent. And you can't just put them in a normal linear regression or an ANOVA that you might run through your usual software. So what you need to do is think about a method that will account for this nesting. And you want to also think about how you can separate this between person variance we talked about earlier, that these two people are different, from a within person variance, that these two people change within themselves across situations. To do this, we primarily use multi-level models. That's a type of mixed effects model, so you may have also heard that term, or mixed model. And those deal with this nesting in the data and also allow us to do some things that will separate into within and between person variance. Now, to run these models, most programs will require your data to be in a long format instead of a wide format. So a long format means you will have 1 row per observation per person. And so for each person in your data set, if there's 70 data points, you'll end up with 70 rows. So they're quite long data sets. And that does usually require you to do a little bit of data restructuring depending on the program that you're using. You also need to think about how to center your data. So those of you who haven't done much multi-level modeling before, but you've done regression, you may have noticed that when you run regression, you have the option to center your data or standardize your data to help you interpret it. So in multi-level models, we think about something called person mean centering often. So what you do when you person mean center is you take the mean around a person's personal mean. So if I'm looking at negative emotion, I center all my data around my own personal mean of negative emotion. And that allows me to make more inferences about how I'm being more negative than usual or less negative than usual, which is something that we're interested in if we're interested in within-person effects or within-person change. So that's usually what you would do with your bottom level momentary data in a multi-level model. But centering is a whole big thing in and of itself, so I'd encourage you to look into it. In these multi-level models, we can also include random effects, so random slopes and random intercepts. And so we can account for the fact that people have different levels and start at different intercepts on their regression line. And also that people may show different slopes, and so they will have their own separate regression line in your particular model. So these are all pretty big, complicated topics in and of themselves, but I'm going to give you some reading later on if you want to get deeper into this. And the last thing you might want to think about is lagging variables. So what you can do in ESM is that you can use the previous survey to predict the next survey. And so this can't establish causality, but can give you a better sense of the directionality of the effect. So I can look at how my negative emotion at the last beep predicts rumination at the next. And I can control for my rumination at the previous survey and my negative emotion at the current survey. So I can run a cross-lagged model, and I can see if the direction that seems to be suggested by my data is that negative affect is associated with subsequent rumination or vice versa. And so that's something that you can do when you have a nice time series data set like this. And so you might need to set up your variables to be lagged in this particular way. And so that does also require a little bit of data restructuring. So how do you actually do all this stuff? Well, many analytic programs offer multi-level modeling. I think almost all of them now, although I'd caution you to watch out for SPSS because the multi-level modeling option there is a little bit problematic. But I generally recommend R. And I do this because there's a lot of really excellent packages that help deal with ESM data in R. So I've put 2 links up here. The first is a tutorial on doing mixed modeling in R. It's not ESM specific, but it's a good primer to get you started. And then this paper is a helpful tutorial on using actual experience sampling data in R, although it was published in 2017, and apparently there's been some changes in the packages since then. So there may be a few things you need to look out for. Here's a few books to have a look at if you're actually interested in doing one of these studies. So this Handbook of Research Methods for Studying Daily Life is a really handy one to get into the methodological pieces and some of the statistical pieces of running a study like this. So I'd really encourage you to have a look at it if you're going to get deeper into it. This book on intensive longitudinal methods is a really nice, more statistical introduction to this kind of research and getting you used to the idea of this nested data format. And this book is on multi-level modeling for social and personality psychology, and it's a really nice beginner's introduction to these concepts for social personality that's a little bit easier to get your teeth into if you aren't someone who's had a lot of a statistics background. Here's a list of some useful articles and chapters that go through ESM, EMA methods. I've pulled them from lots of different disciplines because this is a method that crosses disciplines. So there's some from organizational psychology, some from statistics, some from clinical psych, some from social psych. So hopefully you'll be able to find one that's from your discipline and have a look at the state of the art there. And these have some good practical recommendations in them as well. Here's a list of useful R packages for ESM data. So these are some of the things that I would use in my workflow for analyzing ESM data that might be useful if you're already familiar with R. And there's also some other things in there that I got from people on Twitter for doing different parts of the ESM process. So if you are interested in using R to do ESM analyses, you might want to have a look at some of these packages. And I want to end by thanking the rest of the FEEL lab. And in particular, my co-directors, Pete Cavall and Katie Greenaway, who I borrowed some of the slide content from, Danny Van Oss, our research field lab manager, who helped put these slides together, and Narissa Dozo for running this whole thing. And that's it. Thank you.
Yay! I guess thanks everyone for persevering to the very end of this. Again, we hope that all the slides and resources are super useful in your ESM journey from here on out. And yeah, do send your questions through to us in the survey or also just through to ethics-wellbeing in email. We'd happily compile an FAQ that we can update for people who are dabbling in this research. Happy testing!